Cyrus Khambatta and Robby Barbaro. Thank you so much for joining us on the Plant Trainers podcast today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us on the show. I really appreciate it.
We're so excited to be here.
We're excited to be here. Should we give away the secret?
No secrets.
No secrets? There's no secrets. This is our second time recording this show. We are good to go. This is super exciting. But I'm sure it's going to come out completely different. But maybe our moments of gratitude might be the same. Robby, what's your moment of gratitude today?
My moment of gratitude has not changed. It is the same. I am very grateful for everybody who is supporting our new book, including you guys. And we're just really grateful for everybody who's willing to get this message out, because there's a lot of people to help, and we know this book can help a lot of people.
Mastering Diabetes. Read that full title for us.
The revolutionary method to reverse insulin resistance permanently in type 1, type 1.5, type 2, prediabetes, and gestational diabetes.
We're going to talk about some of those things coming up. Cyrus, what is your moment of gratitude?
So my moment of gratitude today is actually in meeting new friends and learning from others that are also like-minded in this same whole food plant-based revolution. It's literally one of my favorite things to do. And every time I meet people who are cool, who are really trying to change the world, it fills me with a bunch of butterflies, and I really appreciate that.
It's crazy because when we first started on this journey, there weren't as many people out there, or at least publicly, there weren't as many people out there to connect with. And, you know, even before we started the podcast, it was like there just seemed to be a couple of people. And then we started the podcast 5 years ago almost. And we were kind of like, oh my God, what are we going to do when we run out of guests? We're going to have the same people on 10 times. And sometimes it's great to have the same people on 10 times because they can offer 10 times the amount of information. But you know, now it's so wonderful how this community is really growing. So it's great to meet new friends as well.
And of course, with the internet, being able to connect with people worldwide is just an amazing, we're so grateful for that opportunity. And we haven't had anybody on 10 times yet, but we have had a few people on a couple of times.
When I say 10, I mean like 3.
Just like Robby, this is his second appearance on our show.
I mean, I just want to say, Cyrus and I, we've been in this for a long time. So I started in 2006, I think Cyrus in 2004, and I couldn't agree more. Seeing the growth and the people getting involved and how Instagram and YouTube and podcasting is allowing more people to tap into this information and not be stuck into just what the status quo is, what they hear from their doctor, to take control of their own health is really a beautiful thing.
I want to know what's next. Is it like brain casting where you just kind of do a talk show and it goes straight into people's brains? Like what is going to be next for a way of communicating information? It's going to be like,
yeah, it's like Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio. It's like, hold on. Let me just, okay, there you go. Now it's your thought.
Oh, got it.
Awesome. All right. So you just told me telepathically how you guys found plant-based, but why don't you tell everybody else who didn't get that telepathic message?
For sure. So I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in the year 2002. And so I was just a senior trying to graduate from college, studying engineering at the time, and I just wanted to move on with my life. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I went from being a normal, happy-go-lucky guy to a guy that was now living with an insulin prescription, and my whole life changed overnight. So I was urinating 17, 18, 19 times a day, like clockwork every half an hour. My energy levels were incredibly low, and I just remember feeling like something was terribly wrong, but I just didn't know what it was. So I picked up the phone and I called my sister and I explained to her all these symptoms because she's a family practice doctor, and she started crying immediately. Like, she's normally a very cool cucumber and like very calm under pressure, but she started crying immediately and said, "Cyrus, go straight to the health center, go right now." And I was like, "Why?" She said, "Because you're explaining the symptoms of type 1 diabetes. I don't have time to explain, but just go right now." And so I literally was like, "Come on. I don't have type 1 diabetes. I don't even know what diabetes is, but I know it has something to do with old people and cake. And neither one of those applies to me." So, she was just like, "Go." So I showed up at the health center. They transported me to the hospital. Glucose is supposed to be between approximately 70 and 130 on any given day. And my glucose was in excess of 600.
Wow.
So it was way higher than it needed to be. So 24 hours later, I get discharged from the hospital with 2 different types of insulin, syringes, a blood glucose meter, blood glucose test strips, a bracelet that says, hey, I'm like a life alert patient, a carbohydrate counting guide. And they were like, good luck. And I was like, I'm sorry, what just happened? But in addition to that, what was more fascinating than just the diagnosis of type 1 was that they also helped me piece together a puzzle that had been unfolding for the previous 6 months, which is that I was living with not 1, not 2, but 3 autoimmune conditions. The first one is Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, which is an autoimmune destruction of your thyroid gland, which decreases your thyroid hormone output. Number 2 was alopecia universalis, which is why I had no hair, no eyelashes, no eyebrows, no ear hair, none of that. And then number 3 was type 1 diabetes. So all 3 of these set in within 6 months. And at that point, I started to get real concerned that something had taken control of my body, that there was some condition underlying all 3 of these autoimmune conditions that was actually causing a system-wide defect. I didn't know what it was, and I should probably pay attention. So long story short, I listened to what they said, low carbohydrate diet. That's the advice that they give to all people living with diabetes. So I said, fine, sounds good. I like butter. I like cheese. I like meat. I like fish. I can, have more olive oil. No big deal. So I started doing that. And it was supposed to make my blood glucose much more controllable, but my blood glucose started doing the roller coaster thing. High, low, high, low, high, 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 low, low, high, low. And it was exhausting. So for the first year of living with diabetes, I just got to a point where I was like, I feel terrible. My energy levels are decreasing. My blood glucose is all over the place, and my insulin use is climbing. So I started doing my own personal research and came across the idea of becoming a plant-based eater. I didn't look for it. I didn't seek it out. It just appeared. And I started learning under the supervision of a guy named Dr. Doug Graham, who actually has gone on to write a book called The 80-10-10 Diet. He teaches people primarily how to adopt a fruitarian diet. He was the first person that I had met who was qualified and willing to talk nutrition with a person with type 1 diabetes that was outside of the traditional healthcare model. So under his supervision and guidance, he taught me how to eat lots of fruits and lots of vegetables. And in the process of doing so, my carbohydrate intake climbed from about 100 grams per day to 600 grams per day within the first week. So I was eating 6 times as much carbohydrate energy, and I expected that my insulin use would also start to climb, because that's what you're told. That's what the traditional healthcare model tells you. That's what my doctors told me originally, and that's what everybody in the world of diabetes also believes. So I'm fully expecting that my insulin use will go up, but it went down. So I ate 600 grams of carbohydrate per day, and my insulin use fell by 40% in the first week. And I was mind blown because I felt so much better. I was more hydrated. I could return to playing sports, and my blood glucose was way more controllable. So put myself back to graduate school, went to go get a PhD in nutritional biochemistry so I could understand the nitty gritty details of this. And then as a result of that, I ended up meeting Robby, who also had a very similar story living with type 1. And the 2 of us created Mastering Diabetes so that we can teach people around the world how they can transition to a plant-based diet and do it in a step-by-step approach that is backed by research under the support and guidance of a strong network and coaching team. So that's where we are today, and I'm very happy to be here.
I love that that's where you are today. And I think that a lot of our listeners are going to be sharing this show with people who they love, who are not yet plant-based, but who are diabetic. And I think when they hear that 600 count of carbs, I could imagine that a lot of people would be thinking in their head, just hearing that is going to send me into, blood sugar problems, right? Like that's something that we hear, a joke that we hear very often. But we'll get into some of the myths. Robby, you were back on episode 177 of the Plant Trainers podcast quite a while ago. So why don't you give us a little reminder of how you actually stumbled upon a plant-based diet and how that helped you?
Okay, so a super quick version of my story is that I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 12, just about to turn 13. This is January of 2000. So I've been living with type 1 diabetes for about 20 years now. And I basically diagnosed myself. I was thirsty all the time, and I was going to the bathroom all the time. I said, Mom, I think I have diabetes just like Steven. So my middle older brother was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 9 years prior to me. So one day when my parents were gone, I ended up testing my blood glucose, and I was over 400. And you're supposed to be, like Cyrus said, somewhere between 70 and 130. That's 4 times the number it's supposed to be. And he said, yep, you have type 1 diabetes. So I went to the doctor, got the official diagnosis, and that was the beginning of my life with type 1 diabetes. So, of course, just like Cyrus said, you start learning and trying to figure out how can you take better care of yourself? How can you prevent complications? How do you get your best A1C? How do you feel your best? And when you start doing research, you come across a low carbohydrate diet. I mean, that's what you end up finding. So I had plenty of symptoms as a child. I had chronic allergies, even though I would take Nasonex and Claritin D. I had cystic acne, took all kinds of drugs, including Accutane. I had plantar fasciitis, which was really frustrating for a competitive tennis player. I had warts on my feet. And I started trying to do a cleaner diet, following some of these standard recommendations, lower carbohydrate, and didn't see much of an improvement. And eventually, I ended up trying a plant-based ketogenic diet. And while following that diet on as a type 1 diabetic, my 24-hour carbohydrate to insulin ratio was 3:1. So for every 3 grams of carbohydrate I would consume, I needed to inject 1 unit of insulin. And then I eventually found a podcast that Dr. Doug Graham was talking about this fruit-based diet. So I got his book, The 80-10-10 Diet, and Cyrus was one of the testimonials in the back of that book. And I remember Googling him and seeing pictures of him on this website. It was called Organic Athlete. And he was like cycling and super active. And I remember getting very inspired and showing my parents, like, I'm going to get ripped abs just like that guy. It was really funny. And so that was really the beginning of this journey of eating a very high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And I worked with Doug Graham. I did coaching with him, which is one of the best decisions I ever made, to get that coaching support. And as I transitioned, my carbohydrate to insulin ratio has adjusted to roughly 22:1 on a 24-hour basis. So that's a 600% change in insulin sensitivity by eating massive amounts of carbohydrates, same amount as Cyrus, 600, sometimes 700 grams of carbohydrate per day if I'm very active, all while having excellent blood glucose control. So my A1Cs, well, over the past 13 years of following a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, have ranged between 5.3% and 6.2%, with one anomaly at 6.6%. And so for people living with type 1, that's great. We want to be roughly in the low 5s to about 6.5 is a good range. And I also like to showcase that not only do we have great A1Cs, Cyrus and I both, and our clients who follow the Mastering Diabetes method, but we have great blood glucose control. We're not high all the time and low all the time and then getting this good average A1C. That's not what's happening. We have these continuous glucose monitors these days, and we can see our blood glucose numbers all throughout the day. So I love to talk about this time in range concept, where I'm keeping my blood glucose in a healthy range about 90% of the day. And for context, there's been 4 studies on people living with type 1 diabetes and their time in range. And they are ranging roughly between an average of 50% to about 70-ish%. A lot of these people are using automated pumps to help them get to that number. So the 90% number that I can report is really, really strong in the type 1 diabetes community. And we want more and more people to understand that this approach is not just resulting in, a good A1C, but it's also excellent overall blood glucose control, as well as overall health and reduced risk of the chronic conditions that come along with all forms of diabetes.
Those blood glucose levels that you just mentioned, are they standardized around the world, or do different countries have different standards?
There is a different system in Australia and in the UK,
and Canada.
And Canada, correct.
Yeah. So
you do the conversion, you multiply the numbers by, I guess in this case, you would divide it by 18. So if I say my blood glucose is 90, you divide that by 18, and that would give you your number.
Got it.
Right. But yeah, that's what I wanted Canada to understand, because I know when I talk blood sugar levels with my dad, when he's at 3, he's like, needs something now, right? 6, 7, good range. So it's a different calculation. Let's go through a little bit more of the vocab before we get into the juicy stuff, no pun intended. Can you explain for the listeners A1C?
A1C.
Yeah, so A1C is your average blood glucose over a 3-month time period. I don't know if Cyrus, you can add more detail to that if you want.
Yeah, sure. So think about the term A1C as actually a reference to the amount of glucose that is attached to hemoglobin inside of your blood. So what this means is that you have hemoglobin circulating inside of red blood cells in your blood, and there are billions of red blood cells in circulation at all times. So the hemoglobin molecule has one job, and that is to transport, to trap oxygen, to transport that oxygen, and to release that oxygen to tissues all throughout your body that are requiring it. So when you take in a deep breath, like you're actually inflating your lungs with oxygen, that oxygen gets transferred into your blood, and then the hemoglobin molecules are like the catcher's mitt that basically say, okay, I got the oxygen, and then they move with it and they do things with it. The reason that that's important in this glucose world is because the hemoglobin molecule itself can also get glucose molecules attaching to it. And there's a certain amount of glucose that gets what's called glycosylated to hemoglobin and is totally normal and considered perfectly physiologically relevant. And the percentage of all hemoglobin molecules in your blood that are supposed to be glycosylated is somewhere between 4 and 5.7%. So between 4 and 5.7% is perfectly normal. What happens is that as your glucose level starts to rise because you're developing diabetes or you're pre-diabetes, or maybe you've been living with some form of diabetes for a while, the amount of glucose in your blood goes up, which means that the more hemoglobin is getting glycosylated and more glucose residues are attaching to hemoglobin in your blood. So that percentage increases from, call it 5.2% to 5.9% to 6.4% to 7.7% to 8.9%. And before you know it, now you have more hemoglobin that's got these glucose molecules attached to it. And so doctors basically have found out, and researchers have found out, that you can use that as a marker as like an indicator of what your average blood glucose is. And that's why it's a really useful tool in the world of diabetes.
So you don't actually need to monitor it for 3 months straight. That's a test that they could do independently.
Exactly right. Like you can go to the doctor today and you can get your A1C value measured. And what that will do is basically give you an average of what has happened over the past 3 months. And the reason for that is because a red blood cell has a life of approximately 3 months. So the hemoglobin molecule is alive for approximately 3 months, at which point it gets degraded and then you pee it out, or you pee out the remnants of it. So the idea here is that because hemoglobin is only alive for that period of time, that your A1C value reflects what's happened over the life of that hemoglobin molecule.
I want to press rewind for a second because both of you mentioned that you have type 1 diabetes, but you both realized you had it at different ages. And a lot of people have probably learned that type 1 diabetes is something you're born with. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Did you guys have type 1 all your life and only realized it at the age that you had it, or was it something that was developed? That's part one.
Yeah, so we don't know exactly what causes type 1 diabetes. There is some research about some ideas, but it happens. It can happen at any age. We're seeing people in their 60s getting diagnosed in our coaching program. So it happens suddenly. I didn't have type 1 diabetes at age 5, and then it like slowly developed until I got it at age 12. Something happened. Probably roughly maybe a month or so, maybe 2 months before the actual diagnosis, and then you really get hit with it.
I know when I was a kid, we used to call it juvenile diabetes. My parents worked or volunteered for juvenile diabetes. We did a whole bike ride, and then it switched to early onset diabetes, type 1 diabetes, what have you, because people are starting to see it as an older age. What are some of those key features that are kind of, you mentioned that there's research saying that these are some ideas that might be causing it. Is it the animal products? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And the answer, there's the kid. The answer to that question, it depends on who you ask, to be perfectly honest. So, you could get a bunch of endocrinologists in a room, a bunch of researchers in a room, and you could ask them the same question, and you'll get a range of answers. But if you're asking me for my opinion, and what we have read and what we know to be the truth from the research, there's many things that can increase your risk for autoimmune type 1 diabetes. Now, there's also another form of diabetes that's called type 1.5 diabetes. And just to be very clear about what that is, think about type 1.5 diabetes as being another version of diabetes that is autoimmune, except it affects people who are older than the age of 30, and it is a slow onset progression. So it's considered slow onset, adult onset type 1 diabetes. And there's actually a growing percentage of people over the age of 30 that are now developing type 1.5 diabetes. And it's kind of got the autoimmune world kind of throwing their hands up in the air saying, well, why is this happening? There's three things that I can point to that are known to be increasing your risk for either type 1 or type 1.5. The first one is a virus. And there's a particular virus called the Coxsackie virus. And when you develop the Coxsackie virus, it's very well known that your risk for developing autoimmune type 1 diabetes goes up dramatically. The second thing is cow's milk protein. So kids that are introduced, or infants that are introduced to cow's milk protein at a very young age, are at a much higher risk for the development of type 1 diabetes than kids who are breastfed for a longer period of time. So the current recommendations are to breastfeed for at least 1 year, if not moving into the second year of life. And the reason for that is that the mother can basically pass their antibodies down to the kid, and they can help populate the kid's microflora in their large intestine, and they can confer immunity to their child. But some women have a difficult time breastfeeding. And as a result of that, they might transition their child off of breast milk at like 3 months of age or 6 months of age. And then they'll transition them usually to either cow's milk formula or to cow's milk. And in that situation, there are specific compounds inside of the cow's milk that have a very specific amino acid sequence. They're particular proteins. And there's motifs on those amino acid or on the proteins that are very similar to amino acid sequences found on the cell surface of beta cells, the insulin producing beta cells inside of your body. So what ends up happening is that children end up intaking cow's milk, and the cow's milk protein ends up activating their immune system. And as a result of that, the immune system goes, wait a minute, I didn't make that protein. It shouldn't be in my blood. Let me get rid of that. So it tries to neutralize this amino acid sequence. And in the process, there's some friendly crossfire, and it ends up actually attacking the proteins on the cell surface of the beta cells, thus starting the autoimmune process. So in reality, it's the kid's own immune system, or the person's own immune system, that's actually initiating the attack on their own beta cells, thus decreasing insulin production.
Shouldn't that go away with the pasteurization process?
Okay, so the reason that it happens is that pasteurization doesn't actually have much of an effect. And the reason is because if you take a protein that's native to cow's milk, okay, and the protein, if you pasteurize it and you elevate the temperature of it, the protein itself won't break, but the protein will unfold into a more linear structure from a three-dimensional structure, but the amino acid sequence itself will stay intact. So regardless of whether it's a linear protein or whether it's a three-dimensional protein, when you put it into your mouth and it gets inside of your digestive system, what's supposed to happen is that the enzymes inside of your small intestine are supposed to cut up this protein into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller chains. And ideally, under perfect circumstances, your digestive system would chop it into either 1 amino acid, 2 amino acids, or 3 amino acids, otherwise known as, a single amino acid, dipeptides, or tripeptides. And in that situation, those single, di, and tripeptides can be absorbed into your blood without causing any harm. That's what's supposed to happen. But in an infant's gut that doesn't have full protection from its mother over the course of approximately 1 year, they end up with perforations there's what's the word I'm looking for? Permeability, increased gut permeability, meaning that the larger protein chains can actually get inside of their blood by going through the walls of the intestine inside of their bloodstream. And these amino acid chains are longer than 3 amino acids. And then that's where the problem starts. So as soon as those longer amino acid chains are present, then it can trigger the host immune system to create this autoimmune process, which then can spiral out of control and completely eliminate insulin production.
It's mutated bacteria.
I know it's complex.
It is complex. And so can I ask, were you guys breastfed? Or do you know how long you were breastfed for? No, I mean, it's N.
I was, it's a great question. I've actually posted about this on Instagram, and I got a lot of people upset with good reason. So I shared that I was not breastfed. So I'm the youngest. My oldest brother was breastfed. He does not have type 1 diabetes. My middle brother, he was not breastfed. He has type 1 diabetes. I was not breastfed. I have type 1 diabetes. I just shared that fact on social media, just trying to encourage people. And then a lot of people shared how, hey, I breastfed my child and they still got type 1 diabetes. So it's a sensitive topic, which I understand. But yeah, I was not.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, when you share that type of information then on social media, I think a lot of people view it, they sort of get threatened by it. And they think to themselves, well, like if that means that if I wasn't breastfed myself, or that, if I was not going to breastfeed my child, that somehow I'm doing something wrong. Right. In reality, it's not a 1-for-1 relationship. It doesn't mean that 100%.
It's a very sensitive issue for women and for men, but it's a very sensitive issue for women, especially when they can't. So I'm surprised that those are the only comments you got. I'm sure that you got some others, but it's interesting in a bigger, to look at that bigger picture and kind of see. So we talked about type 1 diabetes being the fact that the pancreas is starting to create that insulin, but then the body is saying, wait, this is a foreigner, this shouldn't be happening here. And then it essentially cuts off the process. So the insulin's never really being made, never being brought into the blood system. The type 1.5 is kind of a hybrid between the two. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so think about it this way. Type 1.5 is the same molecular process as type 1. It's just that people with type 1 diabetes generally have a very strong autoimmune reaction. And you can tell that because sometimes they express multiple different antibodies to different proteins within the beta cell architecture. People with type 1.5 usually only express one auto antibody or self-made antibody. And so as a result of that, they're still autoimmune, but it just progresses at a slower rate. And therefore they're considered, they have a slower onset version of type 1 diabetes.
And then we have type 2 diabetes, which I guess in a way could be considered lifestyle diabetes. And some of the myths that we hear are, what I see with some of my clients when I do intake with them, and they say, okay, I don't eat a lot of fruit. I can't have that sugar. And I kind of say, all right, a red flag goes up in my head saying, okay, are you pre-diabetic? Are you diabetic? What's the diagnosis here? And there's actually no diagnosis. They're completely healthy. They're just avoiding fruits and avoiding carbohydrates because there's this myth out there that if we eat a ton of carbohydrates, if we eat a ton of sugar, naturally sugar containing foods, that our body is not going to be able to keep up with all of these diabetes, especially after a certain age. And boom, with all of the sugar, especially after a certain age, and boom, we're going to end up with diabetes. So myth number one, diabetes is not caused by overeating sugar. For those of you who are on the YouTube channel looking at the back of Robby right now, I mean, like, dude, that's his breakfast. It's all mangoes and other fruits that I can't yet pronounce.
Classic.
I mean, I'm just going to share a little bit of my personal experience here on this topic, and then I'm going to let Cyrus take over with a little more of the scientific angle here. But this idea that sugar or fruit or carbohydrate-rich food is the problem with diabetes in general. That's the general consensus, okay? And every time I hear that, just you bringing up that sentence saying, oh, somebody said that to me, just gets me riled up. Like, this is why we wrote the book. This is the information we want to share with people. So separate from the scientific research, which I'll get into in a moment, my personal experience that I had in college when I transitioned to this lifestyle, when I started eating hundreds and hundreds of grams of total carbohydrate per day, and seeing that my insulin requirements, my insulin need to process those carbohydrates was dropping. I realized in that moment, had that insight that what I'm experiencing in my own body is the solution to prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So the problem in prediabetes and type 2 diabetes is that insulin is not being used efficiently. So they're still producing plenty of insulin. It's just not working. So this is insulin resistance. And Cyrus is going to go into detail on this because this is like his favorite thing in the world to talk about, other than his cats. But that's the problem. So as I experience in my own body, okay, wait a minute, wow, I get to eat all these foods and my insulin sensitivity is improving. And then going and digging into the research and seeing, wait a minute, this has been demonstrated since the early 1920s when insulin was discovered. Researchers have shown that as people eat more carbohydrate and reduce their fat intake, their insulin sensitivity improves. And people in the research completely getting off of insulin and absolutely putting type 2 diabetes behind them, just completely reversing it. So this happens repeatedly. So I'll let Cyrus talk about insulin resistance in a little bit more detail. But this idea that sugar causes insulin resistance or causes type 2 diabetes or prediabetes is absolutely incorrect.
So what is the reason that doctors are telling people they need to be on low carbohydrate diets if the evidence has been there for years and years?
Sometimes you ask questions you already know the answers to.
Anyway, no. This is so. I'm so happy. It doesn't matter on what Adam knows. Honestly, like
right.
This is the crux of the argument, right? This is literally the crux of the argument because the low carbohydrate philosophy is not only something that's being applied to diabetes, it's being applied to heart disease and Alzheimer's disease and weight loss and autoimmune disease and fatty liver and cancer. And it's like, the question really becomes like, I consider myself to be open. I'm very open-minded to philosophies and science that I don't know anything about. And I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to understand what is the evidence in support of a particular lifestyle. And does that evidence actually lend, is it strong evidence that actually shows you how you can reverse particular conditions, using a particular lifestyle? And it turns out that the low carbohydrate methodology is something that, I've never been convinced of, absolutely never been convinced of from the moment I first started reading about it. So the low carbohydrate philosophy has gone through many iterations. Atkins diet in the early 70s, Atkins diet again in the 90s, then it turned into the paleo revolution, and now it's in the ketogenic revolution, right? So there's people all around the planet that are eating low carbohydrate diets of some variation. And the most popular of all of them is this ketogenic diet. So in the ketogenic diet, what you do is you basically eat a very low carbohydrate intake, 30 grams of carbohydrate per day or less. And the way that you would accomplish that is by eating foods that are much higher in fat, much higher in protein than we recommend. Okay, so you're eating lots of animal-based foods for most people, meat, chicken, fish, dairy products, and eating very small amounts of either fruits or starchy vegetables, because that's where most of the carbohydrate energy is found. And then also a very small amount or maybe zero refined carbohydrate energy, like cookies and crackers and breads and chips and pastas, okay? So it's a cleaner diet than you would find in the standard American diet, but it's also, again, high in fat and high in protein and very low in carbohydrate energy. So when you do that, your blood glucose stabilizes. You take a high blood glucose of 175 fasting and you adopt a ketogenic diet, and your blood glucose will come down to 82 or 77, and it'll stay flatline for 24 hours a day. And it's a very, very effective technique for reducing your fasting blood glucose, reducing your post-meal blood glucose, for reducing your A1C value like we talked about earlier. But most importantly, people who adopt ketogenic diets end up with a lot of weight loss. So it's a very effective technique for quickly losing weight. And who doesn't want that? Majority of people in the United States today or in the world today are either overweight or obese. And as a result of that, any tool that's an effective weight loss tool is going to be pretty popular. So it promotes weight loss. It drops your blood glucose. In addition to that, it also can drop your cholesterol. And when I say it can drop your cholesterol, what I mean that people who adopt a ketogenic diet often find that because they are losing weight loss is like the first and most powerful domino, that their cholesterol, their total cholesterol level drops, their triglyceride levels drop, their HDL value actually goes up, which is a good thing, but that their LDL values don't necessarily change, or their LDL value goes up. But overall, if you take a look at a lipid panel, most doctors would say, hey, look, your total cholesterol is going down. I like this movement in the right direction. And then finally, we also see people who are losing weight end up with lower blood pressure. And that's a good thing, because hypertension is a huge risk for stroke, and is one of the leading causes of death on the planet today. So you adopt a ketogenic diet, and within a short period of time, you get all these powerful metabolic effects. And most people go into it thinking, great, my long-term or my health is improving, and it's improving very quickly. But the truth is that, yes, all those biomarkers are moving in the right direction in the short term, no questions asked. But in the long term, the picture changes. The picture changes for a number of reasons. Number one, as soon as weight loss stops and it either plateaus, when weight loss plateaus, then a lot of these other biomarkers that were moving in the right direction also stop changing. And so cholesterol levels that had come down, sometimes they tend to go right back up again. Okay. A1C goes down initially, then it starts to come right back up again over the course of time. And people living with diabetes end up using larger amounts of insulin over the course of time. A couple more units today, a couple more units the next day, so on and so forth. And before you know it, now they're back to where they started, even though their carbohydrate intake is very low. And if you look into the evidence-based research, what you'll find is that people who eat low carbohydrate diets are actually at a larger risk for the development of many chronic diseases. There's a type of study that analyzes what happens to large groups of people over long periods of time. And these studies are called epidemiological studies. And these epidemiological studies are designed to be able to understand what happens to like 75,000, 150,000, 200,000 people who are answering questions about their dietary habits. And they're not perfect studies by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of holes. People are filling out these food frequency questionnaires, and it's not the greatest way to collect data. But what they will show is that people who self-report to be eating more animal-based foods over a long period of time, or people who self-report to be eating less carbohydrate energy over a long period of time, are at a much higher risk for the development of heart disease, for the development of cancer, and for the development of many forms of diabetes. And this happens literally in almost every single epidemiological study ever shown, but yet the low carbohydrate world doesn't necessarily want to accept this data, because either they don't want it to be true, or because they have some kind of confirmation bias going into it saying, you know what, this isn't good data.
It was shocking when you hear Robby say this data's been around for, 100, since like the 1920s or what have you, and it's been under wraps. It hasn't been allowed out because for all these other reasons that we talk about all the time, it's just not there. And it's too bad that more and more doctors aren't seeing it at a rapid rate, but we do see more doctors seeing it. But yeah, when you get those results quickly, why not share it? Why not want more people to do it? But then, on top of that, we see people coming in who have hair loss and hormone dysfunction and gout and kidney stones and all of these other things that come out of those low diets. So let's talk about for a minute what's happening when we start to take away the animal fat and the saturated fats from the diet, and we allow a normal amount of blood sugar to come into the body, or not normal amount of sugar to come into the body and a normal amount of blood sugar. What's actually happening with the cell? Let's explain that to everybody, that it can actually function properly, because it's not about having a beautiful Ferrari and keeping it in the garage and never driving it so that it doesn't get a puncture in the tire or what have you. You need to take food out for a spin. The body should be able to deal with it normally. What's getting in the way?
Well, that was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really good analogy. So here's a simple way to think about it. If you eat a diet that's got less saturated fat, and if you eat a diet that tends to be higher in total carbohydrate intake, and at the same time lower in fat and lower in protein, okay? And to be specific, what we recommend is that people eat a diet that is at least 70% carbohydrate energy from whole sources, and then a maximum of 15% protein and a maximum of 15% fat. Okay, so we call it 70, 15, 15 to begin with, or even closer to 80 and 10, which I know for most people are like, wait, what are you talking about? That's a ridiculous amount of carbohydrate. I get it. I understand. But people who do eat this, when you know, and if you look in the research, and if you look at the people that we've sort of like helped transform their life over the course of time, what you will find is that people who eat in according to these macronutrient proportions end up taking on a much smaller amount of total saturated fat. So their total fat intake has gone down, and their saturated fat intake has gone down dramatically. And as a result of that, the saturated fat that has already accumulated inside of namely their muscle and their liver, that has over accumulated over the course of time and sort of inhibited insulin signaling, those saturated fatty acid molecules that are literally inside of muscle tissue and inside of your liver, they have an opportunity to get burned for the first time in a long time. So they start to get burned, they start to get oxidized, and they start to get turned into ATP. And as a result of doing that, the cells in which these fatty acids are now being burned become more responsive to insulin. So it's almost like you got to think of it in two ways. It's like the saturated fat is what inhibits insulin signaling. So if you remove the saturated fat or reduce the amount that's being stored inside of tissues, then insulin has an opportunity to communicate with cells inside of your muscle and cells inside your liver more effectively. So insulin's job is to say, hey, knock, knock, I got glucose from this carbohydrate-rich food. Do you want to take it up? And the cells can either respond by saying, sure, put it inside of me, or no, don't put it inside of me. When a cell has accumulated a significant amount of saturated fat over the course of time, insulin knocks on the door, says, hey, do you want this glucose? And the cells respond by saying, sorry, I can't do it right now. I got to deal with this stuff first. And as a result of that, glucose ends up getting trapped in the blood, causing high blood glucose. But in a situation where you're eating less saturated fat and a higher carbohydrate intake, insulin knocks on the door, says, hey, I got this glucose. Do you want to take it up? And the cells respond by saying, sure, let's do it. Because I don't have that much saturated fat to begin with. I have an appropriate amount of saturated fat, a physiologically normal amount of saturated fat. And as a result of that, I can now communicate with insulin. I listen to insulin. Great. Give me the glucose. I'll take the glucose in. And as a result of that, the glucose that's in your blood starts to go down and down and down. And glucose no longer remains trapped in your blood where it's not supposed to be.
So research
is this making sense?
Yeah, it's totally making sense. So if research is showing us that a plant-based diet is the only diet that can reverse heart disease. If you have type 2 diabetes and you eat maybe 5% animal products and the rest of the time not, can you also reverse your diabetes completely? If you're taking in very little saturated fat. I'm not suggesting that for our listeners or anything like that, but there are some people who are just never willing to go there. And I think I want them to understand to what degree keeping in that little bit can change their life, or will it remain the same?
Absolutely. You bring up a really good point. And the answer is yes, for the overwhelming majority of people living with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. And when I say overwhelming majority, I mean conservatively greater than 80% of that population is capable of reversing prediabetes and type 2 diabetes and getting off their medical record altogether and returning to being a quote unquote normal non-diabetic individual simply by making the right lifestyle changes that we're recommending here. There is a small proportion of the prediabetes and type 2 diabetes population which is not capable of reversing diabetes. And the reason that that would occur is because over the course of time, the beta cells in their pancreas have also been destroyed over the course of time. So they started out with a large beta cell population that then got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller due to their lifestyle over the course of many years. And as a result of that, the resultant size of the beta cell population is so low, so small, that the amount of insulin that these beta cells are capable of producing has gone down to a dangerously low level. So even if you change your lifestyle and you reverse insulin resistance and you become very insulin sensitive, the amount of endogenous insulin that their pancreas is capable of making so low that they're still going to require insulin from the outside world. They're still going to have to inject insulin in order to live a normal life and control their blood glucose with precision.
And you'd probably see that more in a 70-year-old who's been diabetic for 40 years than you would a 35-year-old who's been diabetic for 5 years, because over time the body just learns that, hey, I'm doing all this extra work for nothing, may as well stop.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The longer you've been living with diabetes, the greater your chances of developing what we call insulin dependent type 2 diabetes. But if you were recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes 2 years ago and it hadn't really been in your body for a long period of time, then the chances of you getting to that state are actually quite low.
Have you ever heard about a type 1 diabetic being able to produce insulin and reversing that completely?
So this is a topic I have spent a ridiculous amount of time looking into, okay? The answer to that question is very nuanced. There's actually a recent paper that came out from a doctor in India who, in the title of the research paper, is claiming that they reversed type 1 diabetes with a plant-based diet. And I think, first off, there is no, well, first off, let's talk about that specific paper, okay? Cyrus talked about the confusion or the differences between type 1.5 diabetes and type 1 diabetes. And so the difference is that people living with type 1.5 diabetes still have a decent amount of insulin production. Their beta cells have not been completely destroyed. And the way we know this is through a C-peptide test. So C-peptide is a molecule that's produced in a 1-to-1 ratio with insulin. And then they break off, insulin does its function, C-peptide floats around for an extended period of time, which makes it easier to test. It's a very inexpensive test you can get from Quest or LabCorp. You can order it online from a place like requestatest.com for about $39 to $59. And this test is used to indicate how much insulin you are producing inside your own body. So type 1s, like myself, oftentimes have a C-peptide which is less than 0.1. So that's undetectable. My pancreas is pretty much producing no insulin as far as we can tell. Now, people living with type 1.5 diabetes might have a C-peptide maybe around 0.6, 0.7, 1.0. So this indicates that they are producing a little bit of insulin. And sometimes that can be enough to keep themselves off of medication for an initial period of time. So in this specific paper, where the researcher was claiming to have, again, I like the researcher. He seems like a cool guy. I've never talked to him. I've never met him, but he's advocating for plant-based nutrition, very positive guy. But this paper is a little bit misleading. He reports in the paper that the patient has a C-peptide of 0.7, which automatically means they're not type 1. They have to be less than 0.5 to be living with type 1 diabetes. And they were using insulin prior to coming to him, and then they started adopting the plant-based diet, and they didn't need insulin anymore. And this is actually something that we have seen in the Mastering Diabetes program. People who come to us with a compromised C-peptide level, and they start optimizing their diet and maximize their insulin sensitivity. They eat more and more carbohydrate-rich food, but they don't need to add insulin initially. And we'll see what happens in the coming years with some of these clients that I'm thinking of. But the point is that they've maximized their insulin sensitivity to the point where the insulin they are producing is able to keep their blood glucose within a healthy range without insulin. So the point I'm making here is I have yet to see a research paper or a repeatable solution where somebody living with type 1 diabetes who has a truly compromised C-peptide level is able to turn that around and get their C-peptide to a healthy, normal range and produce plenty of their own insulin to keep their blood glucose in a healthy range, meaning that their A1C would be 5.6% or less in the non-diabetic range without injecting any insulin and having a normal C-peptide level. That is what I would consider reversal of type 1 diabetes. Again, there is no position paper on this. This really isn't a conversation, and the public is really, people just don't believe it's possible. And to a certain extent, it hasn't been done. So I haven't seen it, but that is what would be a true reversal of type 1 diabetes. Now, there are people who get diagnosed with type 1 and make lifestyle change very quickly, very quickly. And in that stage, sometimes you can be put in the honeymoon phase where you start using insulin again, and you're actually able to preserve a little bit of your pancreas's function because you started to inject exogenous insulin. So notice it's getting a little bit nuanced there, but the answer is we do not have a repeatable solution to reverse type 1 diabetes. We do have a method to maximize insulin sensitivity, which in some cases of type 1.5 diabetes, we can hold off the need for insulin. But I don't want to come across as saying that insulin is bad or insulin is the enemy or you don't want to have to use insulin, because the whole bottom line is anybody who's living with insulin-dependent diabetes, any form of compromised beta cell production, the goal is to inject the same amount of insulin your pancreas would have normally secreted when you were following a healthy, natural diet. So that's roughly between maybe 25 to 50 units per day. Cyrus and I are injecting the lower end of that scale and eating way more carbohydrate than people would ever think is imaginable for people living with diabetes. And we can see this repeatedly in our clients. Again, the whole point here is maximizing insulin sensitivity.
This whole discussion has been very scientific from my perspective, and I'm not a very scientific guy. So for the listeners that are here with us and they're thinking, oh, I have type 2 diabetes, or I need to change my lifestyle, or I know somebody with it. I know that in your book that's coming out February 18th, which is the week that this is being put out, it's Mastering Diabetes right there, as you can see on our YouTube channel. And the question that I have is, what types of foods can people that are listening to go to get them started in the right direction? Are there foods that are, I guess, higher on the glycemic index that they should be avoiding? Or like, give us a little bit of your red light, green light kind of thing.
This
I'm so glad you asked.
Robby's favorite topic of all. I couldn't take it away from him. I'm not gonna. Go for it.
This is true. I will admit to that.
It's like cats for Cyrus.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
I mean, we're very proud together, Cyrus and I, of what we've put together in a step-by-step system that is easy to follow and absolutely works repeatedly. So we have a green light, yellow light, red light food system, which makes it very easy to understand actually what food to put in your body to maximize your insulin sensitivity. So the green light category starts out with 4 food categories that are calorie dense. So that's fruits, starchy vegetables, beans, peas, and lentils, and intact whole grains. Those are the first 4 categories, and they're listed first because we want people to be satisfied and stick to the diet. A lot of times, the number one reason people fail on a plant-based diet is they start eating lots of salads and lots of vegetables, and they don't feel satisfied. And then they go run to something they ate previously, a cheeseburger, maybe even some pizza. All of a sudden they get calories, they feel energetic, and they're like, wait, the diet didn't work for me. I had no energy and I ate meat. Now I'm feeling good again. I need meat. And a lot of times it's simply because people are not used to eating the larger volume of food that you get to eat on a plant-based diet. So, and again, for people living with diabetes, they have been scared away from eating those foods, fruits. So that's bananas, mangoes, pears, peaches, berries, all of it. That's potatoes in the starchy category. That's butternut squash. And then things like, beans, like black beans, lentils, red lentils. Then you get into intact whole grains, that's quinoa or farro or wheat, things like that. People are just scared. They're like, if I eat those foods, my blood glucose is going to go up. So we have to teach them that no, that's a temporary issue. It's a temporary problem. That's a symptom, and you're addressing the cause of your blood glucose variability, which is insulin resistance, by eating these whole plant-based foods. So that's why they're listed first. Now, the green light category also includes leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables, herbs and spices, and mushrooms. These are all whole foods that are completely unprocessed. And when you include non-starchy vegetables and leafy greens, you reduce the glycemic load of any given meal. So we're not suggesting that people just, especially in the beginning when they're insulin resistant, we're not suggesting that you just eat, a potato with no vegetables, or just eat, whole meal bananas or something. The book is very prescriptive. We have, over 30 recipes. We have 2 different meal plans depending on your level of insulin resistance. It makes it very clear that greens and non-starchy vegetables are an important component of addressing insulin resistance, especially in the transition period. So there's a lot of people talking about like glycemic index, glycemic load, and it's really a faulty system in the sense that a Snickers bar has, a lower glycemic index than watermelon or banana. And that is not a good indicator. It's not a good system to use to figure out what foods to eat. There's a much broader system here. And you want to look at the overall picture, vitamins, minerals, fiber, antioxidants, and what foods to eat together to maximize your insulin sensitivity. So that's the green light category. Now, the yellow light category, there's 2 criteria. They're either a little bit higher in fat or they're a little bit more processed. So the higher fat ingredients include things like nuts and seeds, avocados, olives, coconut meat. These are all whole, healthy plant foods. We absolutely encourage them. We're just making sure that people are aware that they're high in fat, and you can easily exceed our fat recommendation if you aren't cognizant of how much you're eating. So we're talking about, a quarter of an avocado, a tablespoon or 2 of nuts or seeds. These foods will, in and of themselves, get you past our fat recommendation, which is no more than 30 grams of fat per day, or no more than 15% of calories coming from fat. But again, we're not saying don't eat them, it's just be careful. The green light category, you can eat those foods really ad libitum. When you're hungry till you're satisfied, you don't have to worry or really micromanage how much you're eating of those foods. Now, the other foods in the yellow light category are a little bit more processed. That's foods like Ezekiel bread or brown rice pasta. Again, these are good. You can really include them as part of your program, but they are a little bit more processed. Just a little more processed. So brown rice is going to be better than brown rice pasta. Whatever that Ezekiel bread was originally made out of, we'd rather have you eat that intact whole grain, that original food in its just most natural form. Now, the red light category, we suggest people minimize or completely avoid. This includes animal products. So that's, red meat, that's chicken, that's fish, but it also includes oil. Yeah, dairy's in that category. Oil's in this category because it's one of the most refined foods you can possibly eat. It's essentially pure fat. Maybe if you get a higher quality oil, you might have some leftover nutrients, but in general, vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, carbohydrate, protein has all been removed. You're essentially left with nothing but pure fat. It's just better to eat the whole food that it came from. Have some olives. Have a little bit of coconut meat in your meals. Eat the whole food. You don't need this processed oil that is also the most calorie-dense food on the planet. If you're trying to lose weight and stay satisfied, a very small amount of oil is going to give you a lot of calories, but not fill you up. So oil is a big problem, and we're very clear that that should be minimized or avoided completely. And also processed foods. So there's a lot of new processed foods coming out, and I think it's great for the environment and for animal welfare, but these things like, Impossible Burgers or soy yogurts and foods like that, those, you got to be careful with. And that reminds me to talk about soy. So in the yellow light category, people do ask a lot about this one. Edamame is the whole version of soy product, okay? Like that's natural. It's still a little bit high in fat. So about 40% of calories coming from fat. It's easy to, again, exceed the fat recommendation when you're having edamame. So that's in the yellow light category. And things like tofu and tempeh, we also put in the yellow light category. So again, they can be a part of your program. Just be careful with how much you're consuming. So I hope that's clear. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's really clear. And there's so many good things that we talked about today, and we can definitely take this further, but we will ask you first we will ask you if people do want to continue the conversation, either by reading the book or finding out more about your programs, where would you like them to go?
Well, they can go into a number of different places. Okay, first of all, go to masteringdiabetes.org. That is the main website. There you can learn information about, we have all types of free information on that website. We have rigorous sort of like analysis of science that's like very easy to understand. We also have a whole bunch of testimonial stories on there. We also have some recipes that you can take a look at and start to understand how to incorporate the Mastering Diabetes philosophy into your life. We also have a podcast that you can visit. You can see all of this directly from the website. In addition to that, and we also have an insulin resistance quiz that you can take on our website. So you can just answer a couple of questions. It takes about 2 minutes. And then we do our best at trying to understand what is your level of insulin resistance or your level of insulin sensitivity. We report that information back to you. And then you have a, not research backed answer, but you just have a solid indicator as to, are you low, medium, high, or very high on the insulin resistance scale according to our criteria. So if any of this is interesting to you, if you know anybody that is living with any form of diabetes, or most importantly, at risk for diabetes. At risk for diabetes means that you're either overweight or that diabetes may actually run in your family. If any of this is of concern for you, or you've been told by your doctor that your A1C value is creeping up over time, then the Mastering Diabetes method and the Mastering Diabetes book is something that I think you might gain a lot of information from. And hopefully, we honestly hope that it can help sort of change your perspective on what diabetes is and how you can handle it. And that's my best advice.
That's amazing. You guys are doing such incredible work, helping so many people just get healthier, and getting this book out, Mastering Diabetes, is really going to help so many more people. And we're going to share all those links, all your information in our show notes at planttrainers.com. Just want to thank you both so much for being here with us on the Plant Trainers podcast.
Thank you so much for having us. It's really been fun talking to you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I mean, we really appreciate what you guys are doing. You guys are doing a phenomenal job of really spreading the word about a whole food plant-based diet. You guys are living it yourself, and you're a living testament to just how powerful plant-based nutrition really can be. There's a lot of confusion and myth and folklore in the world of nutrition right now, and I think you guys are doing a phenomenal job of telling it from an honest, credible perspective. So thank you for having us on here, and continue to do what you guys do, because you're changing lives more than you will ever be able to know.
Thanks for your work.
That's great. Thank you.